Think of ancient cavalry, you might imagine chaotic charges or auxiliary troops thrown in haphazardly. But the Hetairoi, the elite Macedonian cavalry, were something else entirely. They were the king's inner circle, and his deadliest weapon. The term Hetairoi literally means companions, and that's no exaggeration. These men not only fought alongside Alexander the Great, they slept near him, ate with him, discussed strategy with him, and died for him. They were, at the same time, his personal guard, his military advisors, and his most feared heavy cavalry. Being a Hetairoi was not for everyone. Most of them were Macedonian nobles, young men from influential families who were trained from childhood in horsemanship, combat, and absolute loyalty to the king. They didn't just have to be brave, they also had to be trustworthy. They formed the most prestigious unit of the Macedonian army. They were treated with a respect that bordered on the sacred. Some ancient chroniclers even described them as a kind of pre-Middle Ages chivalric order, a closed, almost mythical group of warriors with a direct connection to absolute power. And that was no coincidence. Alexander the Great, like his father Philip II, understood something other kings did not, that an army needs not just soldiers, but men willing to die for their commander without hesitation. And that, precisely, was the Hetairoi. But of course, not everything was honor and camaraderie. Being so close to power also meant being exposed to intrigue, favoritism, and betrayal. And sometimes, the price of being a companion of the king was higher than that of being his enemy. Now, beyond their social status and their closeness to Alexander, the Hetairoi had a very clear role in battle. Macedonia's enemies relied on heavy infantry formations and predictable movements. Alexander the Great was betting on something radically different: speed, precision, and the Hetairoi. The Hetairoi were the most feared shock cavalry of their time. They were equipped with ornate bronze helmets, light breastplates, short swords, and most importantly, a ziston, a long spear designed to thrust with devastating force during a charge. Their well-trained horses were not mere mounts, they were an active part of the attack, selected for their endurance and aggressiveness. But what made them truly lethal wasn't just their equipment, but the way they fought. The Hetairoi did not limit themselves to pursuing or flanking the enemy. They were the hammer of the Macedonian army, the arm that executed the decisive blow when the infantry, especially the phalanx with its sarissas, pinned the enemy in place. And then, the charge. Imagine a closed line of enemy infantry, trying to hold off the advance of the phalanx. When suddenly, from one flank, a storm of horses and lances breaks ranks, crosses lines and unleashes chaos. That was the Hetairoi. The famous hook-and-hook tactic, pinning with the phalanx, striking with the cavalry from the flanks, became Alexander's signature. And at the heart of that tactic, there were always the Hetairoi. They were the king's personal spear, and he himself often led the charge, riding at the front with his helmet gleaming. Which was not a simple symbolic gesture, it was a demonstration of power and a warning to the enemy. Because when you saw the Hetairoi riding towards you, you knew the final moment had arrived. And if you want to know how they changed the course of an entire battle, you need to see what they did in some of Alexander's most important campaigns. The Great Battle of Alexander the Great, there comes a moment where everything seems to hang in the balance. The lines tighten, the enemies resist, and then, the usual solution appears, a lightning charge by the Hetairoi, led by the king himself. This was the case at Chaeronea, 338 BC, when a young Alexander, barely 18 years old, led a charge of Hetairoi against the Athenians for the first time. Not only did he defeat them, he broke the line of the Theban veterans, something that was thought impossible. It was his letter of introduction to the world, and the beginning of the legend. At Issus, 333 BC, facing Darius III and the colossal Persian army, Alexander waited for the perfect moment. While the phalanx held the front, he and his Hetairoi charged straight towards the flank where the Persian king himself was. The result? Darius fled the battlefield, and the Persian army collapsed. But the jewel in the crown was Gaugamela, 331 BC, one of the most unequal battles in history. Alexander was outnumbered, surrounded, with elephants, chariots, and tens of thousands of enemies in front of him. And yet, thanks to a brilliant encircling movement, the Hetairoi stormed through the center with such force that the Persian line disintegrated. And Alexander was not far behind. He went to the front, fighting alongside his companions, sword in hand, shouting orders, killing enemies. For the Hetairoi, this was more than a war, it was a choreography of death alongside their king, a sacred moment where absolute trust and precision decided the fate of empires. The Hetairoi's charge was not just a tactic. It was a ritual. One that could change the course of an entire battle in a matter of minutes. But outside the field, these men did not hang up their spears and disappear. They were part of the king's most intimate circle, and there, things got complicated. Battlefield, the Hetairoi functioned as a perfect machine. They charged together, they died together, they obeyed the king without hesitation. But outside of war, unity became much more fragile. The Hetairoi were more than soldiers. Many of them were nobles, heirs to powerful families, ambitious young men educated for war, and also for politics. They were in Alexander's inner circle, which meant they had direct access to the most powerful man in the world. And at the Macedonian court, that was as dangerous as it was valuable. Many of Alexander's most famous generals and officers were Hetairoi, Black Clitus, Perdiccas, Hephaestion, Philotas, Antigonus, Ptolemy. Some were like brothers to the king. Others, like sharp knives behind their backs. The case of Clito is especially tragic. He saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, only to die years later by his own hand, after a drunken argument. Alexander killed him with a spear in a fit of rage. That night, the Hetairoi's camaraderie showed its other side, a dangerous mix of power, pride, and emotional closeness. Others, like Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend, came to share command and were even treated as his equal. But this closeness also generated tension, jealousy, and conspiracies. In an environment where every glance was interpreted, where every word could cost you your life, the Hetairoi lived on the edge of glory and the abyss. Being a companion of the king was an immense honor. But it also meant being under his shadow, his gaze, and his will. Sometimes admired. Sometimes feared. Sometimes eliminated. And when Alexander died in Babylon, the unity of these companions shattered into 1,000 pieces. The question now was, what do the Hetairoi do when there is no longer a king to follow? Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC. His empire collapsed on a single question. Who replaces him? And amidst the chaos, the Hetairoi, his closest companions and generals, ceased to be a military unit and became power-hungry political rivals. There was no longer a king to unite the Hetairoi in common purpose. The sacred bond that had kept them a lethal force on the battlefield dissolved in betrayals, wars, and ambition. The Wars of the Diadochi began, a series of brutal conflicts between Alexander's former companions, all claiming a share of the empire. Many of the Hetairoi who once rode together now clashed on the battlefield. Perdiccas was regent, and then assassinated by his own men. Ptolemy took over Egypt and founded his own dynasty. Seleucus, who was also part of Alexander's entourage, remained in Asia. Antigonus tried to take it all, and ended up dead. The Hetairoi became kings, usurpers, rulers, and traitors. The Brotherhood died with Alexander. What remained was an endless war for control of what he had built. And without that shared ideal, the Hetairoi military unit disappeared. There was no longer a sacred chivalry. In their place emerged the Hellenistic armies, more pragmatic, more political, more impersonal. But his legacy was engraved in military history. They were the first great example of an organized and effective heavy cavalry. Pioneers in shock tactics that influenced centuries of warfare. And a symbol of total loyalty until power intervened. The Hetairoi were much more than warriors on horseback. They were the soul of Alexander's army. And also, in the end, their most human reflection: ambitious, brilliant, dangerous, and deadly.